Hello, everyone. I am Athina. I work at the University of Bern in Switzerland. And this is Julia. She works at the University of Calgary in Canada. And we are both studying functions of the human brain. Today, we're very happy to organize this event, Can Your Science Pass a Kids Review? We are both working with BrainFacts.org and Frontiers for Young Minds as part of the Brain Awareness Week. And the goal of today's event is to invite kids to take part in the scientific process. So we want to show children around the world some of the work that is done to help us understand how the brain works. And also we want to invite kids to critically evaluate this scientific work. So the structure of the event today is that we have scientists who wrote articles for kids and will present those. And we also have 3 kid reviewers who will challenge the scientists with questions on their work. All the articles are written for Frontiers for Young Minds, which is a journal that is dedicated to young readers and is reviewed by young critics. So today we're very happy to have with us Bob Knight and Sabine Kastner, who are founding and chief editors of Frontiers for Young Minds, and they are also part of the BrainFacts.org editorial board. And now I would like to invite Bob to tell us a few words about the journal, and then Sabine to tell us a few words about BrainFacts.org.
Well, thank you very much, Athina, and thank you and Julia for hosting this event. And a special thanks to BrainFacts and the Society for Neuroscience for making this possible. So Frontiers for Young Minds is a journal, as Athina said, is dedicated to putting kids in charge of the scientific process. We want kids to, between the ages of 8 and 15, sort of like pre-high school, to really get insight into what the scientific process is. How does a scientist come up with an idea, a hypothesis? How do they design an experiment? How do they collect the data? How do they analyze it? And how do they put it together for publication so the world can see it? So in this journal is different because that's the standard review process, but in our journal, kids are the reviewers. And the kids benefit from mentorship for each article. The mentors are typically graduate students or postdocs. The kids read the article, they see what they understand and what they don't understand. Just like any review, they come up with questions for the scientist who submitted the paper. It's sent back to the scientist, and just like any other journal, the scientists have to review and address all the issues or questions that the kids have. The bottom line really is we want to put kids at the center of the scientific process and get kids at an earlier age really excited and engaged in what science is all about. So with that, I'll turn it back to Athina. Thank you, Athina.
Thank you, Bob. Sabine, would you like to say us a few words about BrainFacts.org?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Julia and Athina, for being our host today. This is a really exciting event. And thank you also to the Society for Neuroscience and to BrainFacts.org for organizing this event. I'm Sabine Kastner, and I'm a brain scientist like Bob. We are working together on Frontiers for Young Minds for many, many years. And we are also now working together for BrainFacts.org. BrainFacts.org is a wonderful organization. Just go to their website, which is BrainFacts.org. So it's really easy to remember, and you should check it out. The goal is for BrainFacts.org is to inform the public about what we think the most fascinating organ of the human body is, and that's the brain. And they do that in ways that a public can understand it, whether old people or young people in our communities, everybody can just appreciate the short pieces that inform about brain science, about the latest discoveries that have been made in a way that people can appreciate it from all backgrounds. Now, I went actually to BrainFacts.org this morning to see what the latest is, and I learned something about what's going on in my brain when I have goosebumps or when I curse. So you can really learn about many, many curious things. And also about brain diseases on this website. Probably the coolest thing is, though, to explore your own brain. There's a brain model, a 3-dimensional brain model that you can interact with, and you can learn a cohort of, or really a large amount about your own brain by just interacting with it. So look at the cool stuff at BrainFacts.org, check it out, and have fun with the brain.
Thank you to Bob and Sabine for their wonderful introduction. I encourage you all to check out the websites for Frontiers for Young Minds, as well as BrainFacts.org. Okay, so I think we're all ready to get started. I think first up, we have Priti and Kathleen to tell us about the superpowers of ADHD. Take it away.
Awesome. So I will share my screen if it lets me. Great. So can everyone, or let me know if you can't see our first slide here. Awesome. So we'll start. So hi, I'm Kathleen Hupfeld. I'm a PhD student at the University of Florida. And here today are myself and Dr. Priti Shah from the University of Michigan. And we're going to present and answer questions on our research about hyperfocus. So first, what is hyperfocus? So if everyone can imagine for a moment that you're playing a video game that's so fun that you don't realize that somebody's calling your name, or that it got dark outside, or that you forgot to eat dinner. So we call this feeling of very deep, deep attention hyperfocus. So who can hyperfocus? Anybody can hyperfocus, but we think that people with ADHD might experience more hyperfocus than other people. So ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And it's a condition that's associated with a bunch of different symptoms, like trouble organizing yourself, acting without thinking first, difficulty sitting still, trouble paying attention or focusing, and wanting to change activities really often. So this is a little bit confusing. If trouble paying attention and focusing is part of ADHD, why do we think that people with ADHD have more hyperfocus than other people? And so it's because we think that people with ADHD don't necessarily have a deficit of attention, but it's that we think that people with ADHD might have trouble controlling their attention. And so to get into these deep, deep hyperfocus states more so than other people. And so in our recent study, we aimed to test this hypothesis, that people with ADHD have more hyperfocus than other people. So how did we do this? Well, first, we created a way to measure hyperfocus. So we read all of the available research about hyperfocus, and then we interviewed people with ADHD to ask them about hyperfocus. And so this helped us figure out a lot of different things. Like for instance, we found out that hyperfocus is most often to occur in a few different settings, like when doing schoolwork, doing something related to your hobbies, or during screen time, like watching TV or playing video games. And so then we used this information to write a questionnaire to measure people's hyperfocus. And then we tested our questionnaire. First, we did a practice test on 2 smaller groups of people with and without ADHD to help figure out how many people we needed in our bigger study. And then we pre-registered our hypotheses. So we said ahead of time what we thought would happen in our big study. And we predicted that people with ADHD would have higher hyperfocus and that having more ADHD symptoms would relate to more hyperfocus. And then next we tested these hypotheses in 2 bigger groups of people with and without ADHD. And we ran statistical analyses that told us that our data supported both of our hypotheses. So people with ADHD did report higher levels of hyperfocus, and people with higher ADHD symptoms also had higher levels of hyperfocus. And so here's the results from our study. First, this graph is showing that people with ADHD had higher hyperfocus scores across all of our hyperfocus scales. And so the x-axis tells us which of the scales we're looking at. The green bars are people with ADHD, and the blue bars are people without ADHD. And the y-axis tells us about hyperfocus score. So the people with ADHD had higher hyperfocus scores across all of our scales. So for instance, across their school, their hobbies, their screen time activities, and on their personality as a whole. So the data that we collected supported our first hypothesis. And then second, we found that across people with and without ADHD, higher hyperfocus scores related to higher ADHD symptom scores. So again, people with ADHD are in green and people without ADHD are in blue. And the x-axis is our hyperfocus score and the y-axis is our symptom score. So more ADHD symptoms related to higher hyperfocus scores. And so this was true for both ADHD symptoms people had as an adult and symptoms they had as a kid. So again, our data supported our second hypothesis. And so now that we talked about how the data supported both of our hypotheses, we'll talk a little bit about what this might mean. So first, we're not sure what causes hyperfocus or why people with ADHD might hyperfocus more than other people. We think that people with ADHD might have more trouble regulating how much attention they give to different things. So they might have more trouble than other people paying attention in school. But then on the flip side, they might also be able to devote deeper attention for a longer time to activities that they enjoy, like beating a video game. But more research is needed to figure out what brain mechanisms might cause higher hyperfocus in people with ADHD. And second, we don't think hyperfocus is bad at all. It can be a superpower. It can help people accomplish incredible things, like finishing a big art project or writing a book. We just think that the key to hyperfocus is learning to control it. And then third, we think that hyperfocus is a really good example of neurodiversity. So the idea that many conditions like ADHD might represent brain differences and not brain problems. So we think that people with ADHD might not have an attention deficit, but instead they might have a different way of distributing their attention, as well as many other strengths like greater activity or creativity that help them accomplish incredible things. And finally, we think that it's really important for people to know about hyperfocus. Hyperfocus isn't currently a symptom of ADHD, but we think that our research shows that it's something that's really important for people like doctors, therapists, and teachers to know when they're working with folks who have ADHD. And so finally, these are just a couple next steps in our research. We want to shorten our questionnaire to make it shorter and better so that it's easier for other people to use. We want to try to cause hyperfocus in our lab. So getting people to play, for instance, really fun video games so that they can study more about what's going on during an episode of hyperfocus. And then we also want to study things that are related to hyperfocus, like whether people with hyperfocus are more creative. And lastly, we want to study the role of the brain in hyperfocus. So whether there are differences in brain structure, brain function, or brain chemicals that contribute to people's tendency to hyperfocus. And so these are the researchers that contributed to this work, myself, Kathleen, as well as Dr. Preeti Shah, and 3 other graduate student and undergrad researchers. And so that's the end of our presentation. And so Dr. Shah and I are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kathleen, for such an interesting presentation. So Alexi, I hear that you have some questions for Kathleen and Preeti, is that right? Okay, so why don't you ask them now?
Okay. Basically, what does neurodiversity mean in a bit more detail?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so, yeah, so neurodiversity is kind of a big term that just talks about brain differences, right? And the fact that certain brain differences aren't necessarily a problem, but they just cause people to have their brains function a little bit differently. And it can be a big strength. So for instance, people with ADHD who might have high levels of hyperfocus might be a big strength for folks like that. Do you have anything to add, Preeti?
Just that it's basically a way of talking about people as being different from each other, as opposed to some having sort of strengths versus weaknesses.
All right. And please explain the statistics. The statistics, for example, like in Figure 3, what do the dots and lines mean?
Yeah, so say that again. What do which lines mean?
Like the statistics in Figure 3B.
Yeah, so, oh yeah. So that graph was the one that was showing that higher hyperfocus scores related to more ADHD symptoms. So on that graph, each of the dots represented an individual person. So we tested several hundred individual people. And so in that case, the green dots and the green line were people with ADHD, and the blue dots and the blue line were people without ADHD. So the further to the right people were on the graph, the higher their hyperfocus scores, and also the higher their ADHD symptom scores. And so in that case, we ran what's called a linear regression to test whether, using our statistics to test whether higher hyperfocus scores significantly related to higher ADHD symptom scores.
Yeah, and what do the stars mean in Figure 3A? Like those orange stars?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. So in that case, the stars are talking about our statistics. So that was showing that there was a significant difference, that our statistics gave us a significant difference between people with and without ADHD. So that the people with ADHD, the green bars, they showed higher hyperfocus scores than the people without ADHD, according to our statistics.
Okay. I'm pretty sure that's all. And oh wait, yeah. And you also asked what causes hyperfocus, but yeah, you didn't really answer the question. What do you think causes it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so that's something that we don't specifically know. So this study, we wanted to see specifically if it was higher in people with ADHD versus people without, but that's something that we're working on in our lab right now to try to figure out what causes hyperfocus. So one thing we want to potentially do is run some experiments to see if, for instance, people have more trouble switching the tasks that they're doing. So people with higher hyperfocus might have more trouble stopping one task and starting another task. But some long-term future goals, for instance, we're interested in knowing, like measuring the brain, like doing neuroimaging of the brain to see what parts of brain structure and function and chemicals might be different in people who have higher hyperfocus than other people. But that's a really good question. So that's something we're working on, and we don't really have a good answer for it right now.
All right. That's basically it for me.
Yeah, those are excellent questions. Thank you, Alexi. And thank you for answering those questions, Kathleen and Prateen. So, Alexi, I've got a question for you now. What do you think? What's your decision? Do you think that you would accept the paper as is, or do you think that it can maybe improve a little bit? I hear that you've already made a decision. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, I feel like you could technically make it a bit better for and easier for kids to understand, like those graphs, statistics, and other things, and like define neurodiversity in more detail.
Wonderful. And you mentioned that you have prepared something digitally. Did you have like a sign that you wanted to show us, or no?
No,
That's it? Okay, that's great. Thank you, Alexi. So Gigi and Nina, would you agree with Alexi's decision to have the authors maybe improve on their article a little bit? Just give me a thumbs up if you agree with Alexi. Yeah, perfect. Okay, thank you. I guess you have a revise and resubmit then, Kathleen and Pretty. All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you. Thank you both for the presentation and answering the questions. Okay, so next up we have Luana and Dan, and they'll be telling us about blind humans who sing like that. So take it away.
Hello, guys. Thank you so much for this great opportunity and experience. I share my screen right now. I hope you can hear me well. And please confirm to me if you can see the screen right. Are you seeing the screen? Okay. So, hi, everybody. I am Luana. I am a neuroscientist from Brazil, and together with Daniel Damasceno, that's a BET expert, we developed this work that we entitled Things We Share Blind Humans Sing Like Bats. And to start this conversation, it's really important to keep in mind how powerful our senses are, how they connect us with the outside world, they integrate all the information we have and give us the opportunity to react to this world, to make plans, make the best decisions at all. Sometimes we do have a conscious way to think about how we react to things, but some other times we react so fast that we don't even notice about it. That's how important our senses are. And to get out a little bit from the real world and to enter a superhero's world, it's I was wondering if you have ever thought about how superheroes get to know exactly where and when someone is in real danger, how they get so fast to help a person that's crying for help or to get to disarm a tic-tac bomb. They have a real special, and sometimes they take it for granted, that is their super hearing power. That's nothing else than an enhancement of our normal sense of hearing at all. So could you maybe extrapolate or think about if our normal senses could be our real world superpowers at all? Another real world animal that can use their superhero to localize exactly what a prey or an obstacle or objects are the bats. The bats use their super hearing to echolocate, especially when they can't see very well in the dark, for example. And how this echolocation works? The bats are able to emit sounds, vocalizations, we call it, and these vocalizations hits its food, its prey, or a tree, for example, that reacts back, reflects the sounds, and the bats can capture, hear it with their super hearing, and they can construct exactly map of everything that surrounds him. And a question that we made is like, how about humans? Do humans could use this ability? Could we humans could echolocate just like bats do when we lose our sense, for example? And to understand that, it's important to know how our brain actually works, how our brain is organized, and how it allows us to have such a variety of responses to the world. So we can imagine our brain like a bunch of different regions that's connected by a rail network. And these rail networks, it precisely have specific characteristics to carry specific passengers. Who are these passengers? Are the information from the outside world, our senses. So each railway is able to carry specific information. So this rail network can connect not only different stations in the brain that like different regions from the brain, but out connect the brain with the outside world. So if you can see here, the railroad in red, it's the specific rail to carry the visual clues, the visual information. That is the passenger for the sight rail. And in green, you can see the information of the hearing rails, the sound rails, the sound information that's carried out to specific regions on the brain. The last station are generally the cortex, like the vision, the primary visual cortex, and the neural axon, like the main cells of the brain, carry these passengers. They are like the rails, the train rails. So we call it the topographic maps. And to understand if humans can actually echolocate, some scientists, they evaluated blind people and they realized that these blind people could emit mouth clicks, and actually they could find out the obstacles ahead them, the distance, the direction of even the size of these obstacles. And when they evaluated their brains, they observed that actually there is a change of course of the hearing information that actually the sound crossed to navigate to the sight rail, to the vision rail. So this map reorganization we call in neuroscience the neuroplasticity. So it would be like you could see with our ears. So I ask you to finish that what could be the relevance in studying bats? And with all this information, we could think that it would help us to understand human echolocation as a good strategy to improve the lives of blind people and understand the brain's adaptations involved. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'd be glad to receive your questions right now.
Thank you, Luana. It's a great presentation. So I hear that Nina, you have some questions for Luana and Dan. Is that correct? Okay. Do you want to ask some of the questions now? Okay, go ahead.
So I prepared 3 questions.
Perfect.
And the first one is, if bats and dolphins can hear different frequencies, and blind people really on their hearing to navigate the world, can blind people hear different frequencies that sighted people?
Sorry, are you asking if blind people can hear different frequencies, just like the other animals? Yes, they can. They can absolutely. They do the distance of the objects. They actually we will emit different frequencies, the different and the size of the objects, and they can do this. That differentiates when they practice a lot. Blind people, they have this demand that the lack of the sight, the vision, we help them to readapt in a different way. But actually, the people that can see actually also can learn to echolocate as well and develop this ability to perceive these different frequencies that different objects of different sizes can emit, can reflect different echoes actually. Danielle, would you like to add something?
Yes, not so distant from the normal people, from the side people, but yes, they can extend the range of the sound they can hear.
I believe that they are more sensible to differentiate between the frequencies they receive and the echoes, right? Like we talked a little bit before.
Mhm.
But I think
Yes.
the difference of the range is not that different at all from sight, but they are more perceptive to the differences of different echoes. I think it's that what Daniel are trying to say, right?
Yes, and they can differentiate what is his own sound, his own localization call, and he can differentiate what is another noise, another just noise on the environment, just a drop of water.
Yeah. What for most of people would be the same noise, like the same background pollution noise, they can perceive at all the difference of the noises. And sight people don't have that training at all. But actually, I didn't read anything specific about the evaluation of if the range, the limits, the maximum and the minimum limits of the frequencies that they hear. I didn't read anything about it at all, any study specific about it. But it's a really great question that it should be better investigated at all.
My second question was that since neuroplasticity reorganized the brains of blind people and differently, and they have little or no visual input, do they remember things differently?
If they remember things differently because of that reorganization, they have like specific ways of perceiving the world, so that their experiences are different, but the access of memory, for example, if you think about remembering, it's like the same process of sighted people, but their experiences are different from sighted people, you know? I think it answered.
So my third question is that in figure 1 in the image of the brain on the rails, it have in the sight, I don't know, in the taste rail, it has a white dot, and I don't know what is it.
Oh, sorry, it's a mistake of our art, actually. It should be pink as well.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is that all, Nina? Do you have any other questions?
That's it.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So I think there may be some other questions for our other kit reviewers. Alexi, did you have some questions for these authors, for Luana and Dan as well?
No, but I do have a comment that sonars also use echolocation.
Yes, the mechanism is like the same. It's similar. Sonars and radars. They use like the same mechanism like bats and whales. It's really similar.
Great.
Yes, actually, ultrasound scan is the same mechanism. And it was inspired on bats.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Well, Nina, thank you for such good questions and a really insightful comment, Alexi. So what do you think? Do you think that you would accept the paper as is, or do you think that it can maybe improve a little bit? Did you make a decision already?
Yeah, I think that the article is the intention of the article is very good. The images are good, but I think they need to improve a little bit in the mistakes, like the art mistake.
Yeah, that sounds great. Did you have a sign that you prepared for us to show?
This, yeah.
Oh, that's so pretty. That's wonderful. Okay, thank you. That's accept with revisions. Now, Alexi and Gigi, do you agree with Nina's decision? Can I get a thumbs up if you do? Awesome, perfect. All right, so it sounds like you have a accept with revision one and then. Thank you. All right, so last but not least, we have Maria and Nina tell us about aphasia, how the language system can break.
Right. Let me share my screen and we'll get started. All right, can everyone see? All right, so thank you for inviting us to this great event. And today I'm delighted to tell you about our paper on a communication disorder called aphasia and about how our brain makes language possible. So what is aphasia? Aphasia is a language disorder that results from an injury to the brain. And in aphasia, different language abilities can be affected, such as the ability to talk, to understand what is being said, to read and write. And so these language deficits make communication difficult for people with aphasia. Well, how does a person get aphasia? Stroke is the leading cause of aphasia. A stroke, sometimes called a brain attack, happens when blood flow to the brain stops. And blood, as you may know, carries oxygen and other important substances to the brain cells. And without them, the cells there will die and will no longer be able to do their job. So now let's dive deeper into what brain areas are important for language. So in typical right-handers, language is processed by the left hemisphere, the left side of our brain. And so in the left hemisphere, typically what we hear first goes to this area roughly behind our ear. And here we recognize that what we hear are actual speech sounds. And then next, to understand what you have heard, you have to match it to what you already know and then come up with a response. And this happens in this area sort of more in the back of your brain. Next, that idea, thought that you want to express is sent to the front of the brain via this big bundle of fibers that connect back and frontal language areas, kind of like highways connect our cities. Then, in the slower frontal language area, the words you want to say are prepared, and then the primary motor cortex over here sends direct commands to our lips, tongue, and vocal cords to produce that verbal response. Additional brain areas can be recruited depending on the type and difficulty of the language task at hand. So, acquired damage to one or several of the outlying language areas will typically lead to aphasia. So how does aphasia actually sound? Okay, so these are the additional brain areas. And now, if you look at the picture on the screen, I'm sure you would have no problem providing a full, complete description of what is happening here in a few short sentences. So this picture you're looking at comes from one of the commonly used aphasia tests. And its description in individuals with aphasia tells us a lot about the nature of their language problems. So now let's listen to a person with aphasia describing this picture.
This little boy kicked the doll, and then with the baddie tried to looking for the balls, and then she tried also cup those she is picking up those
So as you can hear, this woman is really struggling to come up with the right words, and it is often hard to understand what she's saying. So this person has a Wernicke's type of aphasia. And here at the bottom of the screen, you can see an area of the brain in red that was damaged as a result of the stroke and led to her aphasia. Now, let's listen to another patient with a different lesion describing the very same picture.
What do you call this thing here?
book.
Good, great. It's going to fall on his. Yeah. And what's going on over here? Yeah. What do you call this little guy? Cat.
So as you can hear, this woman has great pronounced difficulty producing even single words and is said to have what we would call a severe case of Broca's aphasia when speaking is primarily affected. So as you can see, injury to all these different language areas leads to different language problems and different types of aphasia. And at the end of my talk, I would like to address a practical issue. How does one communicate with someone who has aphasia? Well, first of all, remember that while the person with aphasia has lost a part of their language, they have not lost their personality or intelligence. They're still the same person as before. You'll just have to find a slightly different way to communicate with them. Here are some communication strategies. Make sure there are no additional distractions in your environment and only one person is talking at a time. Speak slowly and use sentences with simpler words. Give the person with aphasia more time to respond and listen patiently. Be creative in your communication. Use writing, gestures, or pictures to help the person understand you. And if in doubt, ask a question or repeat back what you think the person with aphasia said. With that, we hope our paper sparks your interest for research on language, the brain, and the connection between the two. Many brain mysteries await to be solved. And it will take research by kids like you to fully understand how language works and how we can best help people with aphasia. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to take on any questions.
Thank you, Maria. That was a great presentation. So Gigi, I think you've had some questions for Maria and Nina, isn't that right?
My first question is, what is a lesion?
Well, so for instance, in stroke, as I was saying in my presentation, a stroke happens when blood flow to the brain stops. So for instance, a blood vessel that sends blood to our brain can become blocked over time. And so that stops delivery of blood upstream, and a certain part of our brain stops getting the blood supply. And the cells there without the oxygen and the nutrients, they slowly will stop working. And then if that continues, will die. And that means that part of the brain tissue, the neurons there, they will be dead and they won't be able to function. And that is what we call a lesion in the brain. That's basically a dead piece of the brain. And because it's lesioned, it's not able to work. And then we have, as a result of that, a problem, a deficit. And depending on where that lesion is in the brain, different cognitive functions can be affected.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maria.
Hopefully that helps to understand. And maybe Nina, you want to add something?
A lesion is kind of like what happens when you cut your finger or scrape your knee. So the tissue that has been hurt is what we call a lesion. Lesions can happen in the brain too, because that tissue also gets hurt because it doesn't get the blood supply that it needs to survive. Sometimes we use these terms all the time and we forget that other people don't know them. So thank you for asking the question.
And if I can just add a little bit to that, but the big difference between a lesion on the skin and in the brain is that with skin, luckily, skin can regenerate. And unless it's a huge cut that might result in a scar, I mean, you won't see that lesion a couple of weeks down the line. But with brain, with the brain tissue, with neurons, they don't regenerate. Once a neuron dies, we're not going to get it back.
All right, Gigi, so do you have a second question for them?
Yeah. My second question is, what does deficit mean?
Great question.
Deficit means a problem. So a language deficit is a language problem that a person with aphasia might have. So as you've seen in this video, we would call a deficit with them finding the right words to name parts of the picture the first lady had. The second lady had a deficit with producing single words, so a problem.
Okay, now, so do you have a third question for Maria and Nina?
This isn't really a question, but on page 3, I think, it says that it shows a picture of a pyramid, and like this on another page, it would make more sense if there's a picture of a pyramid on top.
So it would be helpful to, there. I can think of the word. If we had a picture of what that person is trying to describe.
Yeah.
Great, we'll be sure to add that.
Great suggestion. Okay, so now that they've provided their response, Gigi, what do you think? Do you think that you should accept the paper as is, or do you think that it can be a little bit better, so we'll accept with revisions?
Accept with revisions.
All right. Perfect. Alexi and Nina, would you agree? Just maybe a thumbs up showing me if you agree with Gigi's decision. Perfect. Okay, so accept with revisions it is. Maria and Nina, congratulations.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So that sums up our presentations for today. We just like to thank everyone for being here today. We had a lot of fun. I always really enjoy listening to the questions from our young reviewers. We'd like to thank all of the authors for writing such interesting papers for our young readers. We'll now let you revise your paper and then to resubmit. And thank you to our reviewers. We have Alexi, Gigi, and Nina today, who asked really smart and difficult questions and for challenging the scientists. I want you all to know that you've really helped the scientists improve on their papers. And finally, thank you to our mentors, Analia, Lisa, and Finitha, for taking the time to work with our reviewers and to prepare their reviews and provide support to Alexi, Gigi, and Nina. I think Athena maybe has some things to say as well.
Yes. Thanks, Julia. I would like to thank again our reviewers, especially Alexi, Nina, and Gigi, for your great questions. We all learned a lot from you today, so thank you so much for that. And I would also like to thank Frontiers for Young Minds. We're very grateful for having this platform to organize this work today. And we also thank BrainFacts.org for hosting today's event. And Bob and Sabine, do you have anything to add?
Well, first, I'd just really like to thank everybody for their participation. I'd particularly like to thank Alexi and Gigi and Nina for their careful reading of the paper and their questions. I think it really shows what the journal is about. Kids raise questions that sometimes adults never even think of, and these are the future scientists. And for those of you viewing this live review from BrainFacts and SFN, maybe think about whether your work would be valuable to submit to review by our tough kid reviewers, and maybe even other kids who would like to serve as reviewers. So the more the merrier in terms of Frontiers for Young Minds. We want kids from every nation and to be engaged in the science, learning and having fun with science. So thank you all very much.
I would like to thank also Julia and Athena, of course, for being such great hosts today, or moderators of the event. And just to emphasize what Bob said, please help us spread the word for Frontiers for Young Minds and BrainFacts.org. It's real fun way to learn about the brain. And if you are a scientist and you are students of brain science and you want to become involved with Frontiers for Young Minds, you can always shoot us an email, Bob or myself, and we'll be happy to get you involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob and Sabine. I think that wraps up our event. Thank you all again for taking part in this and being here. Hope you had as much fun as we did. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today with us. What you just saw was a recording of our young reviewers asking wonderful questions to our authors and contributing to science and helping them make their papers better. And so now we're happy to take some questions from the audience, I believe. We're very happy to have Bob and Sabine with us here today during this live Q&A panel. For those of you who joined later, Bob and Sabine are the founding and chief editors of Frontiers for Young Minds, and they also are on the editorial board for BrainFacts.org. Okay, so I think we have some first questions here. So one of the first questions, Bob and Sabine, are, is this something that you think any young reviewers, any kid and adolescent can do, or does it require like a huge amount of training?
Should I start, Bob?
Sure.
I do not think that any of our kid reviewers had any specific training. So typically our youngest kids are about 8 years old, so like 3rd, 4th graders in elementary school, and then the older kids can be freshmen in high school. We have articles at different levels, so they're written in different ways for the different age ranges, but the kids don't need any training. They get mentored through this process, and they learn as they go and have fun with it. So there's really no specific knowledge or training that you need as background to become a kid reviewer.
Yeah, I think the only criteria is you have to be a kid. That's pretty much it. And
that's right.
And you're welcome to be in the circus tent for sure. I just would like to say, over the years, that old saying, kids say the darndest things. Well, kids ask the darndest questions sometimes. You'd be amazed at some of the questions that have been sent to our authors over the years. So it's nice to see these, fresh young minds who are not immersed in science coming up with really deep questions about how things work and how the brain works.
Great, thank you. Do the scientists benefit from this type of activity?
I think, yes, in two ways, maybe more than two ways. I think the first way is science communication is hard. It's a difficult thing. And I think when anybody tries to write an article targeted for an 8 to 9 or 10-year-old, you have to be really clear on your ideas. It's not like, you have to. So I think it helps their communication skills. And I don't think this journal is just really good for kids. I think the way these articles are written, and we should be clear, they're not dumbed down. They're just written so they're understandable. I think they're understandable for the general population also. So I think that's a benefit. I think the other thing is that you're seeing many young scientists and more senior scientists with a big commitment to being engaged and doing something to contribute to the world, not just in terms of their own research. So I find that the grad students and the postdocs, that you saw some present today, they really like it. They like the community outreach, and they like the contribution to the growth of scientific understanding.
Just probably one point to add to that. From my perspective, this kind of science communication really sharpens the focus, why that science is important or not. Right. Because I think this is the question we get very, very often. Why is this important? What you have done there, you really have to think about that. Why is it important, and how can we communicate that significance? And the kids really push us in this direction, because you can't escape a kid. You probably can't escape an adult in some ways, but not a kid. And for me, that has really made a huge difference in my own communication with the public, that I have to think about these questions much harder and really nail them down.
Yeah, absolutely. I think being an author myself, I've definitely had to defend my research and also answer some very critical, wonderful questions that the kid reviewers asked of my research. So I think you've touched upon this a little bit, Sabine, already, but maybe Bob, you can elaborate on this as well. So it's a follow-up question to Athena's, which is, so how has your role in this journal and BrainFacts.org helped you or shape your communication about your research to the general audience? I think Sabine, you mentioned that a little bit, but if there's any more you can elaborate on, or Bob, if you want to mention any changes that you've experienced yourself as well.
So probably let me just continue, and then I give it over to Bob. I think what Frontiers for Young Mind did for me was actually to set up a communication with the public. So I do about 20 to 25 outreach events in my local area here in New Jersey. In the New York area, I'm talking specifically to support groups for autism spectrum disorder and attention deficit disorder. And this work, I have not done this work before I started this, because I think I was not really able to communicate, the science that I'm doing to the public. And the work with Frontiers for Young Minds has made that very, very easy and efficient and very enjoyable, actually. And so it really opened a whole new world of public outreach that has become very, very important for my professional activities.
That's wonderful to hear. Thanks, Sabine and Bob.
Ditto for me. It's particularly I really enjoyed the feedback from the kids in the various reviews. Some of the, as you mentioned before, I remember one review where the kid said, this paper is so boring, I couldn't get through the first paragraph. If the authors think it's important, maybe they should make it more exciting in the beginning. And you never would get that input, really. You'd get it veiled in an adult review. The kids just go, boom, this is it. So I've enjoyed that. And I think the outreach, some of our, Sabine and my goals are to get it even more global and in more languages. We now have it in Hebrew, Arabic is coming. We want it available in Spanish and Chinese. So those are some of the outreach goals, that seeing kids so excited about participating, we want to make it more accessible to a wider wider audience. The other thing I think is always important and tough is you want to make sure the journal is not just for kids who are a certain socioeconomic status. So we're making lots of efforts to get into more disadvantaged schools and to make sure it is kids of all spectrums of society get to participate.
That's great. That's a great direction. And not being a native English speaker, I really support this direction a lot. Yeah. We have one question from the audience. What about publications that require a lot of background knowledge for children? Would you have any advice for how to write an article like that?
Yeah,
go ahead, Bob.
Well, no, I mean, no, it's really simple. That's the whole purpose. That's the author has to figure out how to really make the prior infrastructure that led to this study pretty clear to kids. And it's doable. I mean, it may seem daunting, but it is doable. But that's the beauty of trying to write something. It's something for children.
For some practical, I don't know who asked that, but probably somebody who would like to contribute, we don't know. But just for some, practical advice on that, a really good starting point is to break down these complex concepts that you have that are kind of all convoluted in the work, but to really break it down, what are the critical components here? Because you will need to explain those critical components in simple words, but still in a very incisive way, not just boiling it down into something that does not reflect what that concept is. And this is probably a starting point, just to break that down and then try to kind of think about these single components and then to put them back together and to build on that complexity. But basically start with this single or this more simple landscape and then build it from there. Use illustrations. Illustrations really go well with kids, but not the illustrations that you have in your paper, but illustrations that kids can understand, that contain these kind of components, and then again, put that complexity together again. So that is one way, I think, to approach that. And then, at the end of the day, the kids will also give you some feedback on how well you have succeeded on that or not, or where you can improve. And that is the greatest benefit, that you receive that feedback as an author.
One of our co-chief editors, when he submitted a paper years ago, it was reviewed by an 11-year-old a young girl, and she basically said it was so complicated she couldn't understand anything. So she sent him this review, and he revised it to try. It was a complex paper on computational approaches to brain science, and he revised it again. He revised it, sent it back, and she said, "I still don't get it." And he did it yet again. It got published, and he was so enamored with the interaction with the kid that he then became he ended up being one of our associate chief editors, or one of our chief editors for the journal. So I would say whoever asks, just do it. It'll work out. You'll get feedback, and you'll shape your paper. I think Sabine's point about figures is really important. We really like to emphasize. You could see from the papers that were presented in the slide review, fun figures, not just, they have to communicate the scientific essence, but something that's more engaging to kids.
Wonderful. That's a really good suggestion. So we have about a minute left, and I was wondering if both of you would have a final message to any young minds who are interested in becoming a reviewer, what sort of suggestions you might give them, what you might want to tell them to encourage them to take part in this process.
So you can sign up on our web site to become a reviewer if you like. There is a form that allows you to sign up for it. And otherwise, I also suggest just to read broadly. We have not only a neuroscience section actually at Frontiers for Young Minds, we represent also other science areas, and there's a lot to explore. And keep in mind, it is always the latest science that we put in there. It is not something that's 20 years old. It's always the latest science that was just produced and that we are in the field of scientists really excited about, and we wanted to bring it to our next generation of scientists, and that's our kids.
Yeah, I just saw another question. Yes, someone asked a question about classes, and yes, classes can review. A group of kids can be, it could be a single kid reviewer, a couple friends who want to review together, or a class. We can do any of those forms of review, and I've been engaged in each one, and they're all fun. So yes, classes definitely. And I think the bottom line is, we just think that in the end, kids should rule. And we want them to really feel empowered, and we want them to be excited about science. We have over 600 articles published already, and we've got, the last time I checked, over 8 million views. So I think it's being used. We're hoping that it'll become part of teaching plans. That's another long-term goal, not just part of the review and the publication. So there's a lot of things to build on. But the infrastructure is strong because the mentors, the grad students and the postdocs, are very committed to being engaged. They get a lot out of it. They enjoy working with the kids. The kids are empowered, and the authors have to really shape their science so the world can really understand it, not just their subfield.
Wonderful, thank you. So I think that marks the end of our questions. Thank you so much again, Bob and Sabine, for taking the time to share your views and experience. I think it's a very wonderful way to learn about the journal and BrainFacts.org. Thank you, everybody.